And we are still joined by the Executive Director of Core Indonesia think tank, Pak Muhammad Faisal, to talk about the health of Indonesia's economy. Now, prior to the break, Pak Faisal, we were talking about the rupiah, how that kind of affected manufacturing just slightly. Now, earlier, well, today, we have seen the rupiah strengthen to about 15,400 per US dollar, much better than it was at 15,700 in the past days. Do you see the strengthening of the rupiah kind of sustaining, and maybe just talk about the factors behind?
Well, I think pressures on rupiah will persist until next year. The reason is because of the policy by the Fed to fight against inflation, and that's the reason why they keep increasing the interest rates in the U.S. And because of that, there is a capital outflow, from emerging countries, including Indonesia, and there is some depreciation of currencies in the emerging markets. And for rupiah, because recently there is also some response from the Bank Indonesia, increasing the interest rates, and so until today, I think it's about 175 basis point, increase of interest rates, and on top of that, there is also foreign reserves that that is used by Bank Indonesia to fight against capital outflow. So that's why there's a little bit of strengthening, but pressures remains because the target of inflation in America is quite lower, like 2 to 3%. Right now, it's still higher. There's a little bit of slowdown, but it's still high. That means that the Fed will still increase the interest rates. That means that still pressures on capital outflow.
Right, so basically you're saying until the Fed or until the U.S. reach that target of 2%, which is now at 7.7%,
exactly,
we're still going to see a pressure in the rupiah.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, do you have maybe a forecast of how long the rupiah would come under that pressure and maybe how low it could go?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to predict, but I think it's still below 16,000 rupiah per dollar because it's kind of tug of war between the Fed and also the policy from the Bank Indonesia. Yeah.
Do you still see Bank Indonesia being able to kind of sustain the rupiah though?
Yes. Well, if you look at the foreign reserves and also other sort of capital that they have, I think the Bank Indonesia will be able, to fight against the depreciations of rupiah. Yeah.
All right, so you're still optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, projections are difficult.
Yep.
But staying at 15,000,
I think it's still possible. Yeah.
This year.
Yeah. There might be some, depreciations towards closer to 16,000. But again, Bank Indonesia will, I think, will still fight against the further depreciation.
All right. So still some optimism there. Another thing I want to talk to you about is, of course, investments in Indonesia now. Despite the many global economic headwinds we've seen this year, investments continue to grow into Indonesia. It reached the highest in a decade in the third quarter. Now, the country's Minister of Investment said that Indonesia can reach their target of 1,200 trillion rupiah investments for 2022. Do you agree with his, with his statement?
Well, I think it is possible that the target can be achieved for this year. Why? Because investors tend to see actually the long-term prospect instead of looking at the short-term problems like what we're having right now. And Indonesia has a lot of potentials. It is true that our ease of doing business, significantly or relatively lower than the peer countries, but we have a huge market and also natural resources. And one of the factors that push investments in Indonesia is actually investments. One of them is investments in the manufacturing, especially the downstream industry of the nickel mining. Right. Yeah, so that's why even during the pandemic, where in general I think investments contracting, but investments in the downstream industry of nickel is increasing. So and now into 2022 this year and also next year. Manufacturing investments, I think, still, prospective. Services also still prospective because there is, the pandemic more or less can be, tamed, and probably a little bit of a slowdown in the primary sector because of the declining of the commodity prices, but not that significant.
Now, you were talking about nickel just now, investments
Yes.
into nickel downstreaming. Of course, as we talked about earlier in the previous segment, you know, Indonesia is going through this sort of legal battle about
right,
their
yep.
nickel export ban. So
Yep.
if the WTO go ahead with their ruling, do you think that will impact investments into especially nickel downstreaming?
Well, yes, that will impact on the investments, but you know that the government also now is challenging the decisions in the WTO. So that will take some time. Usually the response will take even more than a year. So that we'll still need to see what's going to happen, you know, in the next 1 and 2 years. So investors, I think, still looking, because the Indonesian government is very serious about it, and the policy is clear, and the regulation is also very clear. So as long as I think investors will see the seriousness, and the government will fight against this decision, I think is still, you know, it's not that worrying at this stage, you know.
Okay. Now, I want to move back to a big part of Indonesia's economy, and I think a big part of your outlook as well, which is the domestic market and consumer spending. We saw consumer confidence index increase to 120.3 from the previous 117.2. This was in October. It increased. Now, household consumer spending also rose by 5.39% in the third quarter.
It's true.
The U.S. consumer confidence index, you know, it has dropped as well. It has dropped, excuse me. So in comparison, just explain to us, why are Indonesian consumers so confident compared to maybe advanced economies?
Well, yes, there are some differences in consumer behaviors in Indonesia and in the US.
Right.
First of all, we have a huge domestic market, and our consumers, you know, this domestic market is driven more by the middle and upper income population in terms of contribution to total consumptions.
Right.
And the second one is also because, again, we are less integrated into the global economy. So this is a blessing in disguise. It can be bad or good, but in this case, I think it will help a lot in terms of the growth of domestic consumptions. As long as there are no mobility restrictions like what happened during the pandemic era, early pandemic era in 2020, so I think the domestic consumption will keep growing quite significantly. Well, more or less 5%. There will be a little bit of slowdown probably next year, but not less than 4%.
Right. I suppose amid those forecasts of a global slowdown, what do you think is the biggest risk towards the consumer, you know, consumers' demand in Indonesia?
Okay. So here comes the concerns. I think it also depends on policy responses by the government. And especially if we look at the fiscal responses for next year, there is a so-called normalization of fiscal policy, and the deficit will be reduced below 3%. So meaning that government spending and government incentives will be a bit of contracting for next year. That will potentially impact on the real sector, and including also the domestic demand. So the government, I think, needs to be more careful in phasing out these plans to normalizations of fiscal. Otherwise, it will impact on the real sector more significantly than expected.
Okay. Now, Bank Indonesia's governor, he warned, you know, well, he uttered the words recession, recession, inflation, and also speaking about stagflation as well. You're saying that consumer demand still remains strong. So what are the risks of a stagflation or recession, as Bank Indonesia's governor?
Well, it is primarily characterized by slow economic growth and high inflation, which I think in Indonesia case for next year, I think it will be less likely, because the economic growth, there will be a little bit of a slowdown, but still relatively strong compared to peer countries, above 4% in our outlook. And inflation may be higher, maybe high, but a little bit lower than the inflation for this year. So if we look at these characteristics, I think that the reflation or stagflation, I think, is still far away from it. Right.
Okay, still far away from
Yep.
inflation.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, your broader outlook, is Indonesia safe from a global slowdown or recession?
Indonesia is more resilient to many other peer countries, and there will be a slowdown, but I think it is relatively strong to face the global recession or potential global recession. We cannot say global recession yet,
exactly,
the
right,
potential global recession for next year.
Okay,
Yep.
still safe. the
Still
outlook.
safe. Yep.
Okay. But Muhammad Faisal, Executive Director of Core Indonesia, thank you so much for your insights
You're
today.
welcome.
Thanks for coming to the studio.
Thank you.